Just want to be sure. I'm connecting to Clubhouse now. Testing. Testing. Changing quality to high quality voice. Right. Okay, so let me just make sure. Hello. I need to make sure that there's no feedback. Nothing is here. Hello. No. Hello. That's it. I hope it's broadcasting okay to YouTube. This is just to whet people's appetite as I read Weijian Shan's Money Games before Friday 9 a.m.'s Fix the World Club event. So this book is his second book that highlights the inside story of how American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank, namely the Korean First Bank. It's a fantastic story. It's the first one that has really done a blow-by-blow explanation of the deal. I've done an executive MBA myself. Sadly, most of the time, they just do the deal making and don't really explain what happened after. Especially most of the time, those companies would take at least 10 years to play out. So without further ado, I'm going to start reading. This is the Money Games, the inside story of how American dealmakers saved the Korea's most iconic bank by Weijian Shan. Apologies about my non-Mandarin pronunciation of his name, because my main mother tongue is Cantonese. So in my mother tongue, his name is Dan Weijian. So as you can imagine, it is a bit strange for me to try and pronounce his last name. So without further ado, I'm going to speak and read his book. Forward. In 1998, during the Asian financial crisis, the central banks in many Asian countries melted down and could not protect their nation's currencies or the commercial banks, and thus needed bailouts from the International Monetary Fund. As a condition of these bailouts, the IMF often required the governments of recipient countries to sell off assets, particularly failed commercial banks. Korea was no exception. In fact, it was the poster child for this paradigm. Among the assets the Korean government attempted to sell was Korean First Bank, KFB, KFB had historically been the largest commercial bank in Korea, but by this time had shrunk to the fourth largest. Still, under the right ownership and management, KFB could be a very profitable asset. Accordingly, Korean government officials and their investment bankers went around the world in the hope of finding a strategic investor to turn around KFB. They didn't have much luck. Part of the problem was that the few Western financial institutions interested in KFB wanted to buy the whole bank, and only after the bailout had left all the bad loans with the Korean government. This would leave the good bank for the foreign investors. The Koreans, however, were keen to keep a significant ownership stake so that if the bank were indeed turned around, the Korean government would have something to show for all the financial support it had given KFB by keeping the bad loans. Into this fray came Weijian Shan and his team at Newbridge Capital, the Asian affiliate of our private equity firm TPG. TPG had pioneered the good bank, bad bank model in the United States some years earlier, and we thought that this model could work for the Korean government and the failed banks. Money Games is the story of a major takeover. The origin of the deal, the incredibly difficult negotiations between the Newbridge team and the Korean government, and the subsequent transformation of the most iconic bank in Korea. The first to be fully controlled by a foreign investor. The two sides negotiated for more than a year through a series of understandings and misunderstandings, which ultimately led to the injection of needed capital by Newbridge in KFB for a majority stake with full control of the bank. It was through an arduous process that Newbridge finally took over control of KFB. Shan, our teammates, and I held secret meetings outside of Korea because we were worried our phones might be tapped. Mr. Kimchi was the nickname I was supposedly given by the Korean negotiating team after they had heard me complaining about kimchi, the spicy Korean cabbage, on a tapped phone. Strong personalities and divergent cultures clashed, often resulting in colorful manifestations of different negotiation styles and tactics. It turned out that while negotiating sessions were grinding on, Shan was taking notes and writing detailed memos. These gave Money Games a strong backbone, making it a truly riveting read. Not only does it shed much light on the Asian financial crisis of 1998, but it also serves as an interesting primer for anyone who is curious about how private equity works and how private equity investors make deals and create value. The bank was ultimately restructured by Newbridge, which brought in new management and returned to profitability, particularly in the housing mortgage business, which KFB had more or less invented for Korea. Shan's account of this fascinating story sets forth some lessons for us all. Whether we're private equity veterans or curious outsider hoping to better understand this secretive world, I hope you enjoyed the journey. David Bonderman, Chairman and Founding Partner, TPG, April 9, 2020. So this is the acknowledgement part, Money Games, the inside story of how American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank. Acknowledgements. This book is the inside story of how Newbridge Capital, a US-based private equity firm, acquired and turned around Korea's most iconic bank. Almost everyone in high and middle income countries is the beneficiary of private equity investing. The sovereign wealth funds that manage money on behalf of their country's citizens, the pension funds that provide for government and corporate employees, the endowments that fund schools and universities, not to mention the banks, insurers, and other financial institutions that look after the savings of millions of retail clients. All are active investors in private equity for the benefit of their constituencies. I am grateful to all our investors who have entrusted us with their money over the years, first at Newbridge Capital, then at TPG, and now at PAG. Almost every private equity deal is accomplished by the coordinated effort of a large team involving the dealmakers who source and underwrite the deal, the operational specialists who monitor the company's performance and work closely with its management, the management team itself, and a myriad of financial, legal, accounting, and consulting advisors. Some of these individuals appear in this book, but many do not. And those who deserve recognition are too numerous to name. I thank all my colleagues who worked on the Korean First Bank transaction in their different capacities. This deal would not have been successful without their collective effort. Robert A. Cohen served as CEO of KFB 2001 to 2005. I thank him for leading the rebuilding of the bank and for his memoir, Turning Around the Bank in Korea 2008, which fills some information gap in chapter 15 of this book. David Bonderman, founder and chairman of TPG, has been my mentor and inspiration ever since I began my investment career more than 20 years ago. I owe him a great debt of gratitude for guiding me professionally and for penning the foreword for this book. Mark Clifford, Jill Baker, Tim Morrison, and Christina Varigan helped edit my manuscript at different stages of the writing process. I'm thankful to them for their painstaking and meticulous work. I thank Bill Fallon, Executive Director at Wiley, for his support and help with the publication of this book, as well as my first book, Out of the Gobi, My Story of China and America, 2019. Rachel Kwok provided the best secretarial support any author could hope for, allowing me to concentrate on writing. In the years that I was working on the Korean First Bank transaction, and again, as I was writing this book, my wife, Bin-Shi Shan, our son, Bo Shan, and our daughter, Li-An Shan, often had to endure a distracted and sometimes absent husband and father. I owe them greatly for all I have been able to accomplish, including the publication of this book. Weijian Shan, June 10th, 2020, Hong Kong. So this is the author's note. It can be difficult to decide how to write Korean's name in English. Typically, Korean first name come first, followed by given names, as in President Park Chung-hee or President Kim Dae-jung. When dealing with foreigners, however, many Koreans reverse the order of their family and given names to follow Western convention. Koreans have also abbreviated given names to make them easier for foreigners to remember or pronounce. For example, some people occasionally refer to President Kim Dae-jung as DJ Kim or simply DJ when speaking to foreigners. Some people, especially those who have lived in Western countries, adopt Western first name, which they place before their surname, David Kim, Steve Cho, or Peter Jong. In this book, for the convenience of the reader, I consistently use the Western way to write Korean names, placing the given name first. For example, President Park Chung-hee becomes President Chung-hee Park, and President Kim Dae-jung become President Dae-jung Kim or DJ Kim. There are exceptions, however, in cases where I quote from archived memos and letters, the original references, which may follow Korean convention, remains intact. South Korea's currency is the won, which is something presented as KRW, Korean won. During the period of this book, 1997 to 2004, the won exchange rate against the US dollar fluctuated wildly. In December 1996, the average $1 exchange rate was 842, meaning it took 842 won to buy $1. By February 1998, the won's value had dropped 48%. By December 1998, the won had regained some of its value, reaching 1,213 won per dollar. For the purposes of simplicity, I use the exchange rate at the particular moment in the story to approximate the dollar equivalent. All dollar amounts represent US dollars, unless otherwise indicated. So, preface. Big money legend. Money games. The inside story of the American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank. Preface. Big money legends. It was a brisk autumn day in 1900, and Andrew Carnegie, 66 years old, was enjoying winning a game of golf against 39 years old Charles M. Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie was, at that point, one of America's most prominent businessmen. Carnegie Steel, the company he had founded, had revolutionized industrial steel production and had become the largest steel company in the world. Unbeknownst to him, to Carnegie, Schwab had been working on a plan with John Pierpont Morgan, America's most powerful financier. Schwab's mission was to talk Carnegie into selling his company to Morgan. It was widely known that winning a game of golf always eased the Scottish-born industrialist temperament, and so Schwab played to lose. After the game, Schwab raised the idea with Carnegie, who seemed receptive. The next day, Carnegie handed Schwab a piece of paper scrawled with number, adding up to 480 million, a colossal amount in 1900, approximately 14.5 billion in US dollars today. It was the price Carnegie was willing to accept for the sale of Carnegie Steel. Schwab took the paper to Morgan. Morgan glanced at the figures and said simply, "I accept it." On a handshake, Morgan acquired Carnegie Steel for $480 million. Around the same time, Morgan consolidated several other steel companies to create US Steel in March 1901. Capitalized at $1.4 billion US, $42 billion in 2019, it was the first billion-dollar corporation in the world. Carnegie's cut from the sale of his steel company was about $225 million, $6.7 billion in 2019 dollars. The deal, as Morgan observed wryly while congratulating him, made Carnegie the richest man in the world. For generations, financiers, historians, and the general public had loved telling this tidy little story, amazed at how easy such big money games seemed to be for the rich and powerful. Such games, the private buying and selling of companies and institutions, are now called private equity. And Morgan was probably the first notable private equity dealmaker in history. Many decades before the practice became an industry and acquired its own name. But the real story is unlikely to be so simple. Where, for example, did Morgan get the money to finance a deal? The largest source, providing $225 million out of the $480 million required, came in the form of an IOU, a 50-year bond bearing a 5% interest rate. In other words, Morgan borrowed almost half of the purchase price from Carnegie himself. It is plausible that when he accepted Carnegie's price, Morgan was confident he could raise the vast amount of capital he required, if not from Carnegie, then from other sources. It is plausible, but doubtful. The amount he borrowed from Carnegie represented too large a percentage of the price tag for the deal to work without it. The amount of capital required was more than 2% of US GDP at the time. The same proportion would be equivalent to $426 billion today. Even the great Morgan could not have known for sure if he could raise that sum, or at what cost, or how long it would take, without testing the market first. In any case, securing Carnegie's acceptance of an IOU to be paid over a period of half a century was a critical part of the transaction, and certainly required much negotiation and documentation before the handshake. In the end, how much was borrowed? How much equity capital was raised? Did some of the shareholders of Carnegie's deal swap their shares for the shares of the US deal? Did Morgan put in any of his personal money? What were the exact sources and uses of Morgan's funds? And eventually, what was the outcome for Morgan's brainchild, US deal? How much money did Morgan and his investors ultimately get out of it? Presumably, there were records, locked away somewhere in the house of Morgan, but there is no way to know if these records had survived. The details of the transaction remain hidden from the public eye. The point is that Morgan cannot have agreed to such a big deal without specifying certain conditions, including, for example, his ability to raise the required capital. It is entirely possible that the deal would have fallen apart if Carnegie balked at the idea of lending money to Morgan. There is no way that a deal of this size and complexity could be done in the same manner as one buys vegetable in a grocery store, even if published accounts made it seem so straightforward. Private equity is the art of using other people's money, usually, in bracket, to make investments in private market, usually, in bracket, as opposed to buying up stocks of a company on a public exchange. It is the job and the fiduciary duty of a private equity dealmaker to generate good returns on capital for his or her investors. The dealmaker does not always win, and that is key. No private equity story is complete without knowing if the deal eventually makes or loses money. In view of the tough times US deal went through in the years after its creation, it is possible that those who had entrusted their capital with Morgan ultimately lost money. The moment of deal-making between Carnegie, Schwab, and Morgan occupies a shining spot in the annals of American business. However, the ultimate outcome of the first mega buyout deal in history remains buried. In the past 3 decades, private equity, or PE, had roared into public view, starting with the takeover of RJR Nabisco by Kohlberg, Kravis, Robert and Co. KKR in 1988. The transaction was valued at $25 billion, the largest ever at that time, which awed even Wall Street. PE fascinates the public because of the enormous amount of money it moves around and the high stake of the game it plays. The control of iconic corporate giants can be wrested away, and such deal can make an indelible impact on prominent industries. Then there are the larger-than-life dealmakers, who are often handsomely rewarded for their work to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. In the United States, there are more than twice as many PE-owned private companies as there are public ones. Despite PE's solid presence, there is a dearth of literature about the inner workings of the industry. A few big buyouts have been written about in books, in most cases by journalists who try to piece together from the outside how the deal were made. While they are all fascinating, I'm not aware of any book that tells the full story of a big deal, from beginning to the end, including if the investors eventually made or lost money. This is understandable because it usually takes years for a buyout deal to complete a cycle from the initial investment to the final exit. From the initial investment to the final exit, no business reporters could wait that long to tell the full story. In the case of RJR Nabisco, it took KKR 15 years to get out, long after the deal had been written up in the bestseller Barbarians at the Gate by Wall Street Journal reporters Brian Burrow and John Hailer. As it turned out, the firm had invested $3.5 billion of equity capital in RJR. The rest of the $25 billion was borrowed and eventually lost $730 million, according to news report, making the deal a rather dismal failure. KKR's investors would have been better off leaving the money in a saving account. Much of PE's history is chronicled through accounts which were written too soon, as they usually include only the deal-making parts of the investment, but not how the investment subsequently performed for the investors. Saving the Sun by Financial Times editor Gillian Tett was also published only 3 years after the acquisition of Japan's long-term credit bank. Some of the investors were able to get out early with sizable gains. Others remained invested early nearly 20 years later and may have suffered losses. Dethroning the King by the financial reporter Julie McIntosh was another book recounting events that are far from over. The takeover of the venerated beer giant Anheuser-Busch, orchestrated by the Brazilian PE firm 3G. For these dealmakers and many others, the jury remained out of this would turn out to be good or bad investment. Any idiot can buy a company, Henry Kravis of KKR likes to say. It is what they do with it once it's acquired that matters. To PE investors, the making of a deal, no matter how big, complex, or high profile, is only the beginning. The deal's success or failure can be ascertained only once the investor fully exited from the investment. In the years between the purchase and exit, teams of PE professionals expend great amount of energy and resources to create value with the acquired company, to transform and grow it. To exit from a big investment is often as complicated a deal as the initial acquisition, if not more so. Any mistake in this deal cycle can lead to disaster and financial losses, erasing whatever satisfaction or glory the closing of the transaction brought years prior, and possibly ending the careers of the dealmakers themselves. Seasoned PE investors know that every deal is like walking on thin ice, with a heavy load on their shoulders. They must take great care with every step to avoid plunging into failure. They can celebrate only after reaching the far shore, when they deliver their load into their investors. Private equity is shrouded in mystery, in part because no PE dealmaker, to my knowledge, has written a complete insider's account of a major PE buyout deal from beginning to the end. This book tells the inside story of a profoundly impactful buyout deal, including various twists and turns, successes and setbacks that the American private equity firm at the center of it all encountered. Just as integral as the investor is the setting of the story. Korea, in the immediate aftermath of the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis, the country, whose modern history has been intertwined with that of the United States, was plagued by a beleaguered banking system and widespread economic instability. The depth and severity of Korea's economic crash had come as a surprise to many. Starting in mid-1997, many of the world's most flourishing economies seemed to collapse almost overnight in rapid successions. Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia were the first countries to be hit, with Korea close behind. Curiously, there did not seem to be any particular reason why a crisis that appeared to originate with a collapse of the Thai currency should travel so far north, or why it appeared to mutate into a more virulent strain once it got there. There was no shortage of potential culprits. Some joined Malaysia's then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad in blaming foreign speculators for placing opportunistic bets against American currencies. Some pointed to the massive correlation that ensued once the government was forced to devalue Korea's currency, the won. But many agreed that one of the main reasons that the crisis cut so deeply in Korea was because systemic risk pervaded in its financial system. Nationalized under its authoritarian president Chung Hee-park in the 1960s and nominally privatized in the 1980s, Korea's bank had never fully thrown off the yoke of government control. These banks, regulators, politicians, and Korea's massive industrial conglomerates, known as chaebol, existed in a cozy symbiosis. As part of its decade-long effort to cultivate a prosperous nation, following the privatizations of the Korean War, the government chose the industries and companies to bestow favor on. The banks would extend credit to these companies, which would churn out the steel, ship, and semiconductors that undergirded the Korean economic miracle. Implicit in this arrangement was the idea that the government would come to the aid of the banks or enterprises that ran into financial trouble. The financial crisis brought the entire system crashing down. Many of Korea's largest chaebol went bankrupt or were forced to restructure. Two of the country's largest banks failed and were nationalized. After the International Monetary Fund stepped in with a massive 58 billion rescue package. It mandated that these banks be sold to foreign investors for the purpose of overhauling their shaky lending practices. It was an opportunity to bring some much-needed transparencies and structure to Korea's banking system, and it was felt among the Korean government and global institutions at large that foreign investors would bring in a credit culture to prevent such risky loans from being made again. Private equity is not only a source of capital, it is also a vehicle for new ideas and new way of doing things. Throughout my experience as a private investor, a PE investor in Korea, I was conscious of the fact that we were playing an important role in helping a struggling country achieve necessary changes. Similar reforms were occurring across Asia by choice or by necessity. The government directed economic policies that had served some countries so well during Asia's decades of rapid growth had brought about structural weaknesses that became visible only when the economic earthquake struck. And fixing them was one of the greatest challenges the region faced as it entered the 21st century. Structural reforms are always painful, especially if necessitated by a crisis and partially imposed by conditions for foreign help. At the time, Korea's economic calamity and the onerous restrictions of the IMF bailout were seen as the humiliations of a proud country on a global stage. The reform agenda was championed by a new president, Dae Jong-kim, who had spent his entire life fighting to bring democracy to the country, and who had come to the office only in February 1998, almost at the height of the unprecedented economic crisis. Not everyone in the bureaucracy agreed with his reform agenda, and xenophobia also stood in the way of allowing foreign investors to control the country's venerated financial institutions. Time and again in our negotiations, we had to deal with the two opposing forces, pro and anti-reform, which made the deal process exceedingly difficult and uncertain. However, all the government officials we dealt with were fighting for what they considered to be the best interests of the country and people. They were men of high integrity and selfless dedication to their country. They were all men in brackets, as Korea remained a Confucian and male-dominated society at the time. This book tells the story of the takeover of a national bank and also provides an inside look in real time and behind closed door at how a government grappled with the greatest crisis it had faced since the end of the Korean War. Weijian Shan, Hong Kong, February 2020. So this is a taster for the Money Games book by Weijian Shan. It is almost, I think, what time is it? It's almost, well, it's 2 a.m. now in GMT. And I think I'm getting a bit slightly slurry. So I'm going to call it a day. Hope tomorrow, if I have time, I will read the first chapter and see how far we go. Thank you. Good night.